speaking as a Buddhist practitioner. So I'm just going to talk about, I'd like to sort of evoke, if you like, the idea of how the mother is presented, or let's talk about femininity is presented within Buddhism and how it's been manifested over its 2,500 years of existing, as I should say. So I'd like us all, just for the time being, because we've been crossing time and space quite a lot today, but if we could just take ourselves back to the Indian, to the forests of India, and in our imaginations, just imagine we have a gathering of 7 ascetics, 7 monks. And they've been practicing for 6 years to try and look into the depth of the nature of reality. And in their ascetic practices, they've all not quite succeeded. They've got thinner and thinner, and actually they have found that they haven't fully understood the nature of what it is to be a human. And amongst these ascetics is Siddhartha Gautama, who was born a prince, and it was said of him that he was either going to be a great king or he was going to be a great sage. And his father kept him in the palace until he was 29 in order that he would become a great king. One day Gautama left the palace, and when he left the palace, he saw what he called the 4 sights. He saw disease, he saw birth, he saw old age, none of which he'd been aware of. And he finally saw death. And that's what took him out into the forest with his 7 companions. But after 7 years, he still hadn't found the secret of how to be a human being or how to live it successfully, or should we say in contentment. So in the end, he was actually approached by a young woman who gave him some milk. And I was struck by that. I wasn't going to talk about that today, but we've already had that mentioned earlier on. So the milk actually restored him. So he left his companions. They were very angry with him for leaving. And he decided that he was just going to sit and meditate until he could find this way forward. So he sat himself under what was the Bodhi tree, and he meditated for 7 days and 7 nights. And when he was meditating, he was attacked by the demon Mara, who threw all sorts of temptations in his way. Everything he met, he managed to meet back. When they sent their weapons, he turned them into flowers. But finally, he suddenly found, he suddenly saw into the way things really were. In that moment, he saw all his past lives. He saw them all unfold in front of him. And at that moment, he also saw into what became the sort of principle of Buddhist practice, which is the interconnectedness of all things. He saw that as things come into being, so they fade away. We might say in modern times, he saw a cyclical, holistic view of how things really were. And he saw it at great depth and great profundity. And then he sat there and he thought, how can I possibly communicate this to others? And then what he did was he was sitting in his meditation posture, but what he did was to put his hand down, he touched the earth. And that was the only way this was to be communicated. The moment he touched the earth goddess arose. And she arose to witness. This was very important. witness what he'd seen. And then she wrung out her hair, and that actually, with the water that came from that drowned Ding Mara's armies. So from that moment on, Buddha was aged 29. He then carried on in the forests of India teaching for 50 years until he died peacefully at the age of 82. So that was in a way, the symbol of this was the possibility of reaching enlightenment or seeing into things as they really are as a human being. But what's foundational in this, and isn't really heard very much, is that it did need the earth goddess to witness this. It couldn't happen on a mountaintop entirely on its own. It needed some form of relationship. So that's the sort of background in which I approach this. As I say, I'm not a scholar, but from my practice, my becoming a Buddhist was because I recognized a path, and somehow it felt the right thing to do. And also that Buddhism is in the West, perhaps more so, is very much considered a method of being. That Buddhism offered to me a pathway of understanding my own sense of separation, if you like, or suffering. So I'm going to hopefully share the screen here. I know you've got the sort of background. Okay.
Yeah, that's working.
Great. So we're going to look at the principle of the mother, which isn't emphasized very much. The Buddha was, at the time, he was in a patriarchal society and has set the way in which this has been understood over the years. But I do believe, and it's really very heartening to see the different notions of the mother coming through in the other traditions. So there's the earth goddess emerging on the night of Buddha's enlightenment. And what did he actually see at that time? He saw how all things arise in a moment and fall away. He saw how they're all interconnected. He saw what's called the Four Noble Truths. He saw the truth of suffering, what it means to be human, let's put it that way. And these are expressed as Four Noble Truths. The first is there is suffering. So that is the acceptance of what it means to be human. He also is the second noble truth. There is a cause of suffering. The cause of suffering is not being human, actually. It's wanting us to be a fixed self or craving after other things. And this sounds simple at one level, but it's deeply part of the path is how do we cause suffering for ourselves? The third noble truth is the end of suffering, that we don't have to actually live like that, that we can, there is a pathway out of it. And that was the fourth noble truth, was the noble path that leads from suffering, which I have prepared a paper, if somebody'd like to read it afterwards. Consists of 8 steps, of which meditation is very much part of it. Another formulation that came from his insight was what's called the 3 lakshanas. Life is dissatisfactory, it's impermanent, and there is no real self. So there's the cause of suffering, is clinging to a sense of real self, of an inherent fixed identity. And from his teaching, he established what's called the 3 jewels. So when you become, in most traditions, if you become a Buddhist, you would, say, go to refuge to the 3 jewels. The first is the Dharma, which is the teachings that Buddha taught, obviously, in the forest. To the Buddha, which is not so much as a devotion to a person necessarily, but it's to the principle that within oneself that you have of enlightenment, and to Sangha, which is the spiritual community to support this. Probably one of the first human communities support that was set up around that. So the Buddhist Sangha is a very important part of the teachings. So I'm going to briefly run through 3 forms of Buddhism and just show how the mother and the feminine is represented so differently in each of them. So we talked about the Buddha in the forest. So for the first 500 years, nothing was written down. Except about 450 years later, his teachings were encapsulated within the Pali Canon, and this was codified within the monasteries. And there was this focus on vipassana meditation, which is a stilling and insight. Tended to be more of an austere form, and it was much more for men than women. These hinayanas still exist today in places like Thailand, Sri Lanka and Burma. They would still stay to that earliest form of Buddhism. Later, Mahayana evolved, as all religions and traditions evolve. And this is a very loose framework too. I mean, these schools all exist and still exist alongside each other even today. And here we have a different type of Buddhist visualization practice, and we enter into a realm of bodhisattvas and devas, beautiful figures of contemplation, with practitioners we're taking up as what's called a sadhana practice, where you visualize these beings, and not so much as devotional, but more as over time, over repetition, like you would maybe in sort of chemical practices. You keep that until you begin to embody it. The idea is that you begin to embody the qualities that these beings represent. And then there's the Vajrayana path, which is but Vajra is a diamond thunderbolt, and this is about seeking the truth of reality, meeting with the demons of death and subjugating desire, greed and hatred. So it's still very much those foundational truths, but they run together and they evolve, so that they evolve in their different cultures, and they obviously change culturally, but those key teachings still stay underneath. So in the Hinayana tradition, I've just sort of selected various representations, because obviously I can't, this was, I mean, it was great researching into this, but maybe the most important is Mahapajapati Gautami, who was actually the Buddha's foster mother and aunt. Buddha's mother, called Maya, interestingly enough, died after 7 days. So eventually she brought up the Buddha in the palace. When he went away and came back, he taught his family, so they all practiced the teachings of what he'd seen. And she gathered together 500 nuns, and she wanted to establish a women's sangha. As I mentioned, it was like everything from in the last 2,000 years, a patriarchal society. She had to ask 3 times, and eventually the Buddha was persuaded that she could do that. There's been a lot of debate as to why he didn't allow that straight away, but these are issues of debate. But there she is with her followers requesting permission from the Buddha. She lived apparently till she was 120 and practiced and gained all the skills, the spiritual achievements that were possible, that came out from these practices. And when she was just about to die, the Buddha said to her, "Now go, Ananda," he was one of the disciples of Buddha, "tell the monks my mother has reached nirvana." So his mother had actually reached the stage of enlightenment. "Dear Gautami, she who carefully raised me when I was helpless has gone to a deep peace, just like the stars at sunrise. If you honour me, honour my mother, Gautami." Sorry, I found this really quite moving. Know this, she was most wise, with wisdom vast and whole and wide. So this connection between the relationship between the male and female principles are threaded through, even though we don't hear them that much. With them turning into the Mahayana traditions, you get these rich visualization practices. This is what's called the refuge tree, and which lineage you're actually ordained into. You have, I don't know whether you can see that, and you probably can't. You see on towards the left-hand side, you have the monks of the Buddhist Sangha of the Hinayana tradition. You've got the bodhisattvas on the right side, and then you visualize all the teachers of the past, the lineages, and what you will have memorized their teachings, and you will be embodying them day after day in your heart. And here we have the fiery demon-like forms of the bodhisattvas. So in a sense, what we have here is both light and dark. We've talked a bit about Kali and the shadow and the light in the traditions. So in the Mahayana tradition, here we have green Tara, very, very popular as a sadhana practice. So her leg is outstretched and with a willingness to be present, guiding the action of sentient beings. These represent twin areas of compassion and wisdom, and she's ready to spontaneously leap into the world, just as a mother protects children. I'm going to move on quickly because I want to get to the end of this. The Vajrayana is the third turning, very basically from Tibet, and here you have the fiercer side of Tara as she's evolved. Here she's got 3 eyes, she's got 4 arms, and she's surrounded by skulls. She's got a necklace of heads representing endless birth and death, and she's standing on the Azura, which is a sort of Titan, Rahu. Rahu was said to have covered over the shadow of the sun. So you can see how a lot of themes we've been having today just keep coming back in these different forms. So she's subjugating him, and she's surrounded by flames of blissful awareness or clarity of vision. Here is perhaps one of the most famous Vajra Yogini. Vajra is the thunderbolt. She's drinking from the skull cap of blood to represent the bliss of moving away from place of being a human. So this is about overcoming not death itself, but how one is through visualizations, one cuts away a sense of identity to the self. So you can see here's death down the bottom. You could see some of the many bodhisattvas of the tradition, and at the top you've got the lineage of all the different teachers, which you would be visualizing day by day, so that you sort of really learn to embody these teachings. And then I couldn't go by, having seen this morning, to just reference Prajna Paramita, the perfection of wisdom literature, developed around 100 BC in the Mahayana. This was another later evolution, but it is represented by the goddess Prajna Paramita, which is the perfection. It is seeing through, cutting through the nature of reality, and seeing actually into what we loosely talk about emptiness in Buddhism. Emptiness can sound quite alienated. I often think about emptiness and fullness together is how I would think about that. It's the fullness, but the emptiness is not fixed. So what's happening now? We've had 3 turnings of the wheel in Buddhism. In Tibetan Buddhism, about 600 BC, which was when Buddhism came to Tibet, We have the Shambhala prophecy, which says there comes a time when life on earth is in great danger. Great barbarian powers have risen. Although these powers spend their wealth in preparations to annihilate one another, they have much in common. Weapons of unfathomable destructive power and technologies that lay waste our world. Now is the time of great courage, moral and physical courage is required of the Shambhala warriors. For they must go into the heart of barbarian power. To dismantle the weapons in every sense of the term, they must go into the corridors of power where decisions are made. The Shambhala warriors have the courage to do this because they know that these weapons are mind-made, made by human mind. They can be unmade by human mind. And they train in the use of two weapons, which is what the practices are working towards: compassion, the recognition of our pain in the world, and wisdom, the experience of our radical interconnectedness with life. So this prophecy was said to be when the iron bird flies, and I think it might be very appropriate for our times as we're facing so much, I would say, devastation by the misuse of technology. So this is a sort of in second strand of what might that look like today. I'm also a mindfulness-based psychotherapist, and these Buddhist practices or mindfulness practices are being used quite extensively in psychotherapy today, but particularly with trauma, and particularly with all findings on neuroscience. So what these visualization practices do, they offer an opportunity to become embodied within nature, to recognize oneself not as a fixed identity, but as an ever-arising set of conditioned processes. Deeper and deeper awareness practice can get you to understand how those are created, but they arise in relationship to other conditions. So what I was saying earlier, we co-arise with our environment, and our bodies too, and our thoughts co-arise as part of nature. So the last 20 years has been a lot of progress, a lot of use of mindfulness methods in psychotherapy, also in education and business. Part of my work for many years was trying to introduce mindfulness practices into business, trying to find more ways of being in relationship with each other, actually, through the way we live our daily lives. So just touching, I've got notes on these if anybody wants to find out, but we've seen that Buddhist practices work on the interconnected of all things, including how processes such as emotions, thoughts and sensations co-arise. In fact, what's happening when we're doing these practices, and that's not just in the Buddhist tradition actually, but the practitioner is honing the nervous system, which is what gets triggered in the fight and flight mechanism of trauma. So by getting to learn how to work with these, I think this is why these methods are proving to be so useful, by sitting with clients. So the stilling practices of Vipassana meditation slow down the parasympathetic system, calming the fight and flight, while the more intense visualization practices though, can excite the sympathetic nervous system so that the body can be taken out of paralysis, which is the collapse part of the fight flight. So that's an explanation of how and why they work. The fact is they do. I think that John Kabat-Zinn was one of the first to bring them into a form that can be taught quite readily. And what he says is that the heart of mindfulness-based interventions lies in deep silence, stillness and open-heartedness that's native to pure awareness, which we find in those Prajna Parimitā traditions. And it can be experienced directly, both personally and interpersonally. And I think the emphasis here for the current times is on that interpersonal, and as Father Dominic was talking about, the relational, and I think that's would be how Buddhism at least is evolving in a certain way. So the consequences of such cultivation may go far beyond symptom reduction and conventional coping adjustments, defining new ways of being in the body and the world. And I think this is moving psychotherapy and Buddhism actually into different territory, in that actually other things arise in the room with clients than just analysis. So turning full circle here, we've seen very briefly the world of the ancient yogis and the Dakinis. Those Vajra Yogini is one of the Dakinis we saw earlier with the red passion. It's also the perspective of the quantum world. And here the teachings of the Buddha, as witnessed by the Earth Goddess, offer up a potential antidote to the suffering of our times. It's validated by findings of neuroscience. There's 20 years of really robust research now that shows how these practices work, and a quantum worldview that is in itself multidimensional and mysterious. So as much as we know, really. And it's a nice connection between the East and the West. And in sense of the return of the mother, in these challenging and complex times, we can turn to the inherent and unconditional acceptance for life, which we find in all the traditions, as it really is. Life as it really is, not trying to escape it, not seeking to change or improve it, but simply accepting, resonating, seeing deeply in the same way as the mother accepts her child with love, wisdom, and fierce protection. So, I'll stop share now. We've got 3 minutes left for questions.
Thank you very much, Bronwen. Wonderful.